June 5, 1942, a valley near Bakhchisarai, Crimea. 2,500 men have spent 5 weeks laying railway track, digging embankments, assembling components, and preparing a firing position for a single weapon. The weapon is 47.3 meters long. Its barrel alone is 32.5 meters, as tall as an 11-story building laid on its side. It weighs 1,350 tons, more than a fully loaded Boeing 747, 12 times over. It requires 2 anti-aircraft battalions, dedicated solely to protecting it from air attack, and 250 men just to assemble it. It fires a shell weighing 4.8 tons. When that shell lands, it excavates a crater 10 meters wide and 10 meters deep. It can penetrate 7 meters of reinforced concrete, and it fires once every 30 to 45 minutes, delivering 14 rounds on a good day. A mortar crew of 3 men can fire 14 rounds in under 2 minutes. The weapon that required 2,500 men, 5 weeks, and its own dedicated railway line, had just achieved the same rate of fire as a small artillery team. Its name was Schwerer Gustav, Heavy Gustav. It was the largest caliber rifled weapon ever fired in combat, the heaviest mobile artillery piece ever built, and the most expensive and logistically demanding conventional weapon in the history of warfare. It fired 47 rounds at Sevastopol. It destroyed 1 confirmed ammunition magazine, knocked out several fortified positions, and contributed to the eventual fall of the city. Then it was packed up, shipped to Leningrad, sat unused through the entire winter of 1942, was moved again, used briefly near Warsaw, and destroyed by its own crew in 1945, so the Soviets could not capture it. In 3 years of theoretical deployment, it fired fewer rounds than a single medium artillery battery could fire in a day. The biggest gun ever built had accomplished almost nothing. The men who built it had spent 7 million Reichsmarks and 4 years of engineering effort on a weapon that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that bigger was not better, and had never been better, and would never be better. The lesson was already known. Germany built the gun anyway. To understand why the Schwerer Gustav existed, you need to understand what France built in the 1930s and what it made German military planners believe about the future of warfare. The Maginot Line was a continuous fortified barrier running along the Franco-German border from Switzerland to Luxembourg, a network of underground fortresses, artillery batteries, and anti-tank obstacles that French military doctrine believed would make any direct German invasion impossible. The fortresses were buried under meters of reinforced concrete. Their guns were housed in retractable steel turrets. Some of the deepest installations sat beneath 30 meters of earth. French engineers had calculated that no existing artillery weapon could penetrate them. They were almost certainly correct. In 1936, Hitler requested that Krupp design a weapon that could. The requirement was specific: a gun capable of penetrating 1 meter of steel armor, or 7 meters of reinforced concrete, or 30 meters of packed earth, whichever proved most relevant in practice. The only caliber that could achieve this at combat ranges was 800mm shell weighing 7 tons, fired at sufficient velocity to penetrate the Maginot Line's deepest installations, would need a barrel the length of a building and a carriage the weight of a battleship. Krupp's chief engineers Fritz Rausenberger and Erich Müller spent 2 years on the design. The calculations confirmed what intuition suggested: a gun capable of meeting the specification would have to be so large that it could only be transported by railway, could only be assembled in place over weeks, and could only fire from fixed positions. The traverse would be limited to what the curve of the railway could achieve, roughly 1 degree per length of curved track. The elevation could change, but the azimuth could only change if workers physically curved the rails beneath the gun. It would be, in every meaningful operational sense, an immobile weapon capable of striking targets at known fixed positions from a fixed firing point that the enemy would identify within hours of the first shot. It was not a battlefield weapon. It was a siege weapon, a piece of engineering conceived for the static warfare of 1916 in a year when German panzers were already proving that mobility, not fortification, would define the conflict ahead. Mass, 1,350 tons. Barrel length, 32.5 meters. Diameter, 800 millimeters. Crew, 250 to assemble the gun in 3 days or 54 hours. 2,500 to lay track and dig embankments. 2 flak battalions to protect the gun from air attack. Rate of fire, 1 round every 30 to 45 minutes, or typically 14 rounds a day. The numbers were not just large, they were operationally absurd. The crew requirement of 2,500 men for track laying and emplacement exceeded the garrison of many of the fortresses the gun was designed to destroy. The 5-week emplacement time meant that any position the gun occupied would be known to the enemy for weeks before it fired a single round. The 2 dedicated anti-aircraft battalions meant that the weapon required its own air defense umbrella, consuming resources that might have been more usefully employed elsewhere. Transporting just the gun components required 25 railway wagons, with the trains stretching over 1,500 meters in length. Moving the Gustav from one front to another required a dedicated military operation in itself. The Maginot Line, for which all of this had been built, was never attacked. Germany invaded France, through Belgium, outflanking the line entirely. When France fell in 46 days in the summer of 1940, the Schwerer Gustav was still not operational. The fortresses it had been designed to destroy surrendered without it. Hitler found himself in possession of the most expensive and elaborate siege weapon in human history, with no siege to conduct and no obvious purpose. He looked at the map. Sevastopol was on the map. Sevastopol had fortifications. It would do. Stited Index 21x20. In early 1942, the German High Command finally selected a suitable target for it, the fortress of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. During Operation Barbarossa, German forces had occupied most of the peninsula but had failed to capture this strong fortress. The Sevastopol fortress was an ideal location for traditional siege warfare. The move to Crimea required the same 25-wagon train, the same 5 weeks of preparation, the same dedicated anti-aircraft units. It took nearly 5 weeks before the gun was in place and ready to fire. The Germans then started pounding Soviet targets on June 5. The gun fired just 48 times before its barrel became worn out and needed replacing. The most famous shot of the entire campaign was the one that destroyed a Soviet ammunition magazine buried beneath the waters of Severnaya Bay. A 4.8-ton shell had penetrated the bay's floor, driven through 30 meters of earth and rock beneath the water, and detonated inside an underground storage facility that conventional artillery could not have reached. It was a genuinely remarkable demonstration of what 800mm penetration could achieve. It was also one of 47 confirmed shots fired over the entire siege, a rate of approximately one useful target destroyed per 47 rounds, in conditions where the gun had been specifically designed and specifically positioned to achieve exactly this effect. The barrel wore out after 48 rounds and required replacement. The replacement barrel was fitted and firing resumed. After replacement, the large gun was fired nearly 300 more times in total during the siege. Sevastopol eventually fell to German ground forces, to conventional artillery, to infantry assault, to the combined weight of the 11th Army under Erich von Manstein. The Schwerer Gustav's contribution was real, but unmeasurable. It had destroyed positions that conventional artillery could not have reached, but the city had been surrounded and besieged by forces that did not require the gun to accomplish the encirclement. The question of whether those same resources, 2,500 men, 7 million Reichsmarks, the engineering effort of Krupp's finest designers, could have contributed more effectively to the war effort in other forms, was never seriously asked because the gun already existed and someone had to use it. After Sevastopol, the operational record grew thinner with each deployment. Leningrad was the next stop for the 80mm gun and probably was planned to be used in the Warsaw Uprising like other German heavy artillery weapons, but the rebellion was crushed before the heavy artillery was needed. The Schwerer Gustav was loaded, transported, partially assembled at Leningrad, and then the Soviet counteroffensive pushed the German lines back before it could fire. It was loaded again and transported west. Near Warsaw in 1944, it fired approximately 30 rounds into the city during the Polish Uprising, an act of destruction directed at a city rather than a fortification, a role for which ordinary artillery would have sufficed equally well. Then the war's trajectory made further deployments impossible. Leningrad Batititsits. The railway gun is reported to have been fired 47 times against the city of Sevastopol in 1942 before the bore was worn out and the barrel needed to be replaced. This was the only confirmed use of the superweapon during the Second World War. The companion weapon, Dora, the second of the two guns completed, had an even thinner combat record. Dora was present at Sevastopol, but there is historical debate about whether it fired in anger at all. Some accounts credit it with rounds during the siege. Others suggest it remained in reserve. What is certain is that Dora was never deployed beyond Sevastopol and was captured or destroyed at the end of the war without having achieved anything of verified military significance. The third gun, Schwerer Gustav, was never completed. Site Index 26:1. The Germans demolished Schwerer Gustav in 1945, near the very end of World War II, so it would not be confiscated by the Soviet Army. The decision was made by the Wehrmacht itself, not a battlefield loss, not a capture, not even a dignified museum preservation. The men who had built it, transported it, assembled it, protected it, and fired it, blew it up so an enemy could not claim it. The pieces were eventually found and studied by Allied engineers. The study concluded what every honest assessment of the gun's operational record had already suggested, that a weapon requiring 2,500 men and 5 weeks of preparation to fire 14 shells a day was not a weapon the modern battlefield could support, regardless of what those shells could do when they arrived. The Schwerer Gustav existed because a specific engineering challenge, penetrating the Maginot Line, required a specific caliber, and that caliber required everything else to follow from it. The chain of engineering logic was internally consistent. The 800mm bore was the minimum necessary to deliver the penetration required. The shell size followed from the bore, the barrel length followed from the shell size and the required muzzle velocity, the weight followed from the barrel. The railway mounting followed from the weight, the crew size followed from the weight and the assembly requirements. Every step was rationally derived from the step before it. The result was a weapon that was too large for the battlefield to support, too slow to be relevant to a war of movement, and too expensive to justify against its actual contribution. The Maginot Line the gun was built to defeat was bypassed by panzers in 1940 while the gun sat unfinished in the Krupp workshops. The siege at Sevastopol, that gave it its only real deployment, ended when German infantry fought their way into the city, not when the Gustav's shells ran out. The lesson of the Schwerer Gustav is not about caliber or engineering or even ambition. It is about the difference between what a weapon can do and what a war actually requires. Hitler wanted something that could destroy anything it aimed at. He built it. It could destroy almost anything it aimed at, and the war moved on without it.